initial letter, which doesn't appear in the Scripture. It is still there, and it has been exacerbated now because of the arrival of the false teachers who have brought in another form of pagan religion mingled with perhaps Judaism and somehow Christianity to make it more palatable. And so here are these erstwhile Corinthians flopping back and forth from Christ to their pagan religion of the past, sometimes unwittingly. And so Paul makes a direct statement in verse 14 that is the command, the mandate, the standard, and the principle which is elucidated in the rest of the text. It is this: do not be bound together with unbelievers. That is a classic statement. As I said, probably the most familiar statement out of this entire letter. It is a classic call by the apostle to separation from unbelievers. And in fact, that is the greatest challenge that you as a Christian have. And me too. Not to be bound together with unbelievers is our greatest challenge. To live a separated life is a tremendous challenge, particularly in a culture which is bombarding us with all of the elements of paganism. It is not only our greatest challenge, it is our greatest source of joy and usefulness when we obey that command. Now, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Well, first of all, the term bound together is usually translated unequally yoked because it comes from a Greek term that can have that implication. In fact, the Greek term, the Greek verb that is sometimes translated unequally yoked, heterozugeo, can be used of yoking up in a common effort. Paul draws this analogy, however, not from the usage of the Greek term, but from a concept back in Deuteronomy 22:10. When God was laying out prescriptions for the conduct of his people, he gave them a lot of prescriptions that on the surface are not particularly spiritual. They had to do with the uniqueness of Israel's life. But some of them were very practical and wise. And one of the things that he instructed them, recorded in Deuteronomy 22:10, is that they were not to plow with an ox and an ass yoked together. And the reasons for that are obvious. Those two animals have two different natures. They don't have the same gait. They don't have the same disposition. They don't have the same strength. They don't have the same kind of instincts. Completely different natures. You can't yoke them up and expect a straight furrow. And Paul is borrowing off of that analogy and using a Greek term that was used in that same kind of way, speaking of unequal yokes or equal yokes. In fact, in Paul's time, that very verb was used to refer to teachers linked up in a common religion or a common philosophy or a common school who did not agree, and they were said to be unequally yoked. And so Paul is borrowing from the Hebrew analogy of the Old Testament and as well borrowing from some of the Greek usage of that very term, because it does mean to be yoked. To be involved in a common enterprise, linked together, and to have to do the same thing in perfect harmony is an utter impossibility if we are talking about a believer and an unbeliever. Do not allow yourself to be bound together in a yoke with an unbeliever. Now that opens up all kinds of possibilities. What in the world does Paul mean when he says, don't be bound together with unbelievers? How are we to understand that? Because the implications of that have all kinds of significance for our lives. Now, somebody's going to come along and say, well, look, in the purest and truest sense, it's really calling you to the monastic lifestyle. Just isolate yourself. That's really what it was, the misinterpretation of this that was behind the monastic mentality. And some of us in a more modern environment might say, well, what it really means is you better be sure that you buy your home from a Christian real estate agent and you buy your car from a Christian car dealer, and that you make sure you got Christian neighbors, and you make sure that you have your kids in a Christian school, and you make sure you buy your insurance from a Christian agent, and you make sure you find a Christian butcher, and on and on and on ad infinitum. And we just cannot get into any kind of thing and make sure, boy, you don't want to be in a mutual fund. Boy, then you're really linked up with unbelievers. And you better be careful who's putting money in your bank. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Where do we draw this line here? How far does this go? What about dating? What about marriage? What about a partnership? What about being on a team? What about working together with someone? What about recreating together with them? What about a mutual fund? What about a common business? What about a partnership? What about a limited partnership? What about? Where do we draw the line here? What are we talking about? Are we supposed to go out of the world? Well, that's kind of hard, because the Great Commission says, go into the world and preach the gospel to every creature, right? So we're not supposed to go out of the world. In fact, look what Paul said to the Corinthians. They would understand that statement in the context of what he had already said to them. So let's go back to 1 Corinthians and see how Paul defines what he means by that. And he sets some very clear parameters so that we don't have to be confused. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20. Now, Paul, verse 19 really sets it up. Although I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all that I might win the more. Now, Paul is saying, look, I'm free from all men in one sense. I have been catapulted into the kingdom of light. There's no encumbrances in this world. But I have made myself consciously and purposely a slave to them all for evangelistic purposes. So Paul didn't want to pull out of the world. He was anything but a monastic. I mean, he was in the middle of everything. He was in the middle of every crowd there was. He was like Jesus. He created crowds. He went where the sinners were for the purpose of evangelism. And he says, verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. He became a Jew, and to those fastidious law-keeping Pharisees, he even followed their path, if need be, to win them. And to those who are without law, Gentiles, verse 21, he became as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. And I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Another way of saying that I might have partners in this deal. I want to win people to Christ. So look, Paul didn't leave the world. He didn't run from it. He got right in the middle of it for the purpose of leading people to the knowledge of Christ. He is not calling for isolation. There's no place for isolation from unbelievers. If God wanted us isolated from unbelievers, He would have saved us and instantly catapulted us into heaven. He's not calling for isolation. In fact,